Okay, so we finally got the iPhone 14, the iPhone 14 Pro, and the iPhone 14 Pro Max in the studio, so I'm going to quickly unbox them and then test out the new features. Starting off with the iPhone 14, as you can probably tell, Apple changed the front of the box. As before, they were showing us the back of the phone, now we have the front of the iPhone 14. Same thing on the sides as before, the iPhone branding that matches the color of the phone that's inside. Now, when it comes to the 14 Pro box, this has changed in quite a few ways. We first have, once again, the front of the phone that shows that dynamic island compared to the back, and the box is also white compared to the black box that we used to have before with the Pro models. There you go, the purple iPhone 14 Pro. And same as before, we simply get the Lightning to USB-C cable, and then we get the Designed by Apple in California booklet. Interesting enough, we do not have a quick start guide anymore. Oh, and by the way, the unboxing experience is exactly the same on the iPhone 14 and the 14 Pro Max. And next up, I want to take a quick look at the new colors. So with the iPhone 14, we have the new blue, which I gotta say looks really, really good in person. This is how it compares to the Pacific Blue on the 12 Pro. Sadly, this is the only blue iPhone that we have, but honestly, it looks great. It's got a bit of a purple tint to it from what I can tell. But other than that, it's a really, really nice blue. Next up, we have the new deep purple iPhone 14 Pro. So let me just remove the wrap first. And first impressions of the deep purple, it looks pretty good. It's definitely darker than what I was expecting. This is how it compares to the Pacific Blue. So it's about the same in terms of darkness. It's just that it's purple and still blue. It is a really nice color, so I do quite like it. And then we have the second new color, which is the space black iPhone 14 Pro Max. And this is my favorite. So let's take a quick look and compare this against the graphite 13 Pro Max and the space gray 11 Pro. So I gotta say, first impressions, it's not as dark as I was expecting and hoping. But compared to the 13 Pro Max, it is definitely darker just by a tiny, tiny bit. But I would say that an even bigger difference in terms of the color is the frame. So if you take a look at where the buttons are, the 14 Pro Max is almost perfectly black compared to the gray stainless steel frame that the 13 Pro had. Oh, and I don't know if you guys can tell, the 11 Pro's frame was also very dark, but this one is even darker, and the 13 Pro was somewhere in the middle. And by the way, just take a look at how massive the camera module is on the 14 Pro compared to even 13 Pro, not even to mention the 12 Pro and the 11 Pro. The difference is just gigantic. And because of that massive module, we now have some serious table wobble. Just take a look at this. This is a 13 Pro, and now the 13. Next up, I'm curious to test the dynamic island, and as you can probably tell, it is fully visible when the phone is off, and it is way bigger than I was expecting. And now when the phone is on, the dynamic island is in full use, and to be honest, I can easily tell where the display is and where the sensor area actually is. So sadly, it doesn't really appear to be as seamless as Apple portrayed it at the event. Okay, so the phones have been fully set up and the dynamic island is functional. And like I said before, it is bigger than I thought, and you can still see, even when the phones are turned on, the area, the softer part of it, essentially. So let's test out some dynamic island functionality. So if we tap on it, it doesn't really do anything, but you actually get this haptic feedback, and you can see the dynamic island interact when you touch it. Same applies for voice memos. So if I record something now, and then I close the app, you can see that I'm getting the time and the actual recording in the dynamic island, and I can tap it to bring this up again. Also, if let's say you're doing a voice recording and then you go back to the clock to set a timer, you're actually gonna get both. So you can see the timer being right there. So if I tap on it, it's gonna switch to that app. Also, if you hold on it while you have an ongoing process like this, you'll get a couple of more options, like in this case, pausing the timer or even canceling it entirely. But it seems like right now, it doesn't really work for a few things that you would expect it to work for. For example, if you set a stopwatch, if you start a stopwatch, it's not actually gonna show you that. It only works for timers for some reason. But I think an issue with the dynamic island is just how difficult it is to reach because it's at the very top of the phone. So on the 14 Pro, I can actually reach it quite easily, as you can probably tell. But on the 14 Pro Max, it's way more difficult just because this phone is huge. Now, another big new feature with the iPhone 14 Pros is the always-on display. But this actually works in a bit of a different way than how it works on Android, as in, when you lock your phone, your iPhone will simply make the lock screen dimmer. And I've seen quite a few people complaining that it is too bright, and I gotta say, it is I don't know, maybe it is a bit too bright. It is mostly weird in the way that it works very differently from all the always on displays that I've used before. Now, even though there's no setting to actually adjust the brightness of it, it is related to the brightness of your phone. So right now, my brightness is maxed out, so if I lock it, the always on display will be quite bright. But if I dim this to about the same level as the always on display itself, then when I lock it, it's gonna be even darker. And something that I'm really curious to test is when it comes to notifications when using the always on display. Apple hasn't actually showed us how that works at the event, and I haven't really seen this in any other reviews either. So there we go, we just got a message. So now when we lock the phone, the notification will simply stay there. However, you cannot really interact with it until you tap on the lock screen, and then you'll be able to clear it or tap to go into it. So yes, notifications are visible on the always on display. And then if you have a process running in the dynamic island, like the timer, and then you lock the phone, you will get this in the always on display. But as you can tell, you'll only be able to see the minutes, not the seconds. And then when you tap on it, that's when it will show you the seconds as well. Okay, now the next thing that I really wanted to test was the outdoor brightness, as Apple claimed double the brightness compared to the 13 Pro, up to 2000 nits. So we went outside, and luckily it was a really sunny day. And interesting enough, we couldn't really see any difference, and I'm not even kidding, any difference between the 13 Pro and the 14 Pro. At least not until we moved to a different spot that was even sunnier, and we tested the brightness levels in the app jar as opposed to the settings. And it turns out that the difference in that case was massive. So if you are viewing a white page, such as settings or websites, then you won't actually see a difference, but when it comes to something that is not pure white, the difference will be very, very noticeable. And even when we compared it to the S22 Ultra, there was a noticeable difference there too. Then we tested the front-facing camera, as this also got a pretty big upgrade from the 13 Pro. We have a larger aperture and autofocus, and I was really curious to see if any of these would actually make any difference. And I gotta say, the selfie on the 14 Pro actually looks worse than on the 13 Pro. So that's because the aperture is larger, the background will be more blurred, but it seems like the 14 Pro is still applying a lot of sharpening, which makes the background look especially bad. However, that autofocus does seem to work pretty well. I was able to get a close-up shot of my eye, which looks decent, but of course you cannot really compare this to the actual macro mode on the back-facing camera. Speaking of the back-facing camera, I was really curious to see how the quality compares against the 13 Pro, if we actually get some noticeable improvements, and versus the S22 Ultra. Now, we are going to have a more detailed camera comparison, so these are just some very quick tests. So the photo quality was overall good, but basically identical to the 13 Pro from the tests that we've done. This sadly means that the sky was often overexposed. Some of the shots were a tiny bit brighter than on the 13 Pro, but overall the differences were very minor. Now, the S22 Ultra had its own share of issues. For example, it underexposed quite often, and in some of the photos, the edges were quite blurry. I was, however, quite impressed when it came to the shutter speed, which was very fast on the iPhone 14 Pro compared to the S22 Ultra, despite having a pretty large megapixel count. For example, if you take a look at this shot, this tree, it was actually quite windy, and the iPhone got it perfectly in focus, whereas the S22 Ultra got it quite blurry. In terms of the telephoto module, I wanted to see if it would be any better than the 13 Pro, and I gotta say, it is a tiny bit better, so the photonic engine does seem to help a bit. But I gotta say, the thing that impressed me the most in terms of the camera was that new 48 megapixel RAW mode. And yeah, the photos looked incredible. You have a ton of details in those compared to the 12 megapixel version. So yeah, that's great. Of course, if you don't really plan to shoot in RAW, then that's pretty much useless to you. But if you do, then this is actually a very big upgrade. But like I said before, we'll be doing a much more detailed camera comparison between the 14 Pro, 13 Pro, S22 Ultra, and maybe even the Pixel 6 Pro if you guys want to see that. And in that video, we'll be comparing the night mode shots, video, portrait, macro, and a ton more. And also do let us know what sort of iPhone 14 videos do you guys want to see next. But yeah, I'm Daniel, this is ZONEofTECH, and I'll see you guys in the next one. ZONEofTECH, signing out. Cheers.